Today we're diving deep into a really provocative question about Christianity. Was Paul the apostle even real or just a literary invention?
Yeah. I mean, think about it. The iconic story of Saul turning into Paul on the Damascus Road, all that dramatic transformation and then spreading gospel across the empire.
Exactly. And then there's that whole saga in Acts. Jail escapes, angelic rescues, surviving snake bites. It almost sounds like a comic book story, right?
Absolutely. Right. And when you throw in scholars like Kenneth Humphreys, who essentially argue that Paul might be a theological construct rather than a historical figure, it really challenges our traditional views.
Yeah, it's like, were they, urgently needing a figurehead for the growing church and then just stitch together a compelling narrative?
Yep. So the question is, did Paul actually exist, or is he the church's first great invention?
Right, and the argument brings up so many points, like, for example, the discrepancies between the account in the book of Acts and Paul's own letters.
Exactly. On one hand, Acts paints a picture of a superhero Paul, traveling, performing miracles, and overcoming obstacles that border on mythical.
And on the other hand, his epistles come across as much more human and occasionally even like self-defensive.
Yeah.
There's a clear tension there.
Let's talk specifically about that. I mean, his letters portray him as someone who often feels the need to defend his position, contradicting other apostles and claiming divine revelation almost too conveniently.
Yeah, and it just makes you wonder if these letters were written later to support an already evolving theology rather than being genuine, first-hand accounts of historical events.
That's an interesting angle. Exactly. And the dating issue adds another layer of complexity. Some scholars suggest that even the authentic letters of Paul were, composed after major events like the fall of the temple in 70 CE.
Yeah, which implies that they might have been retrofitted to explain a rapidly changing religious landscape, essentially creating Paul as a bridge between Jewish messianism and the Roman world.
Right. And it's almost like the church needed a sort of founder figure, a person who could carry the weight of a unifying, expansive faith. Paul, in many ways, perfectly fits that need.
Exactly. Like the narrative is designed to be super convenient. It's like they needed someone who could consolidate power and rationale for the new global mission. And so they gave him an epic backstory.
I get that. But, I do wonder, aren't we perhaps oversimplifying by labeling him as purely a fiction? There are historians who believe there was an actual person here, even if his story might have been embellished.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think it's important to consider that the real Paul might have existed, but his legend could have grown over time, much like urban legends.
Precisely. Right. So it's not necessarily an either-or scenario. It's possible that a real individual did exist and then became mythologized to suit the theological and political needs of early Christianity.
Exactly. And think about this. The vertiginous narratives, like shaking off a snake bite or surviving shipwrecks, are just so outlandish that they necessarily raise eyebrows. It's almost like a Marvel movie script rather than a historical account.
And Kenneth Humphreys, along with other skeptical scholars, argues that when you visit sites like Ephesus or Corinth, you don't find tangible evidence or footprints of this transformative journey Paul was supposed to have made, right?
Right. It's all evidence of carefully crafted narratives aimed at providing legitimacy to a fleggling religious movement.
Plus, the stark differences between Pauline epistles and the dramatic episodes in Acts, it almost creates a portrait of two completely different kinds of Paul. One is the rebellious, sometimes combative figure in the letters. The other is this almost superhuman figure in Acts.
Exactly, and that disparity makes you question if the Acts narrative was, written with ulterior motives to solidify Pauline authority and or centralized doctrine.
Right, that's a good observation. And you have the little detail about his physical remains, right? The anecdote where like different parts of his body are claimed by various churches across the Mediterranean. It's almost absurdly mythological.
Absolutely. It's like a relic scavenger hunt. One church has his elbow, another his skull. It's hard not to see that as a symbolism that reinforces his sacredness, even if it's not historically grounded.
And then there's the way his letters are presented. Some scholars even suggest they're composites, stitched together from multiple sources over time, rather than accounts from a single consistent author.
Yeah, exactly, which kind of undermines the narrative of a sole authoritative voice behind the gospel, doesn't it?
Yep, right. So it becomes a challenge to differentiate between the real historical figure and the crafted persona that the early church might have needed.
And that brings us back to the big question. Is Paul real, or is he the product of a deliberately
Absolutely.
constructed myth?
It's so interesting because it hits at the heart of how religions construct narratives for legitimacy. A figure like Paul might have been essential for bridging, disparate cultural and theological gaps during the church's formative years.
Right. It's almost like they needed a symbolic rallying point, someone who could represent a unified doctrine in a time of transition and upheaval.
Mm-hmm. I get that, but here's my challenge. If Paul was just invented out of necessity, then why do we see a consistent thread in his teachings across different texts? Shouldn't an invented figure be more contradictory than integrative?
That's a valid critique. I mean, if you look closely, there are contradictions in his portrayal, the letter versus Acts differences, and even the theological nuances that seem designed to address different audiences. But then again, that could also be evidence of multiple layers being added to a kernel of historical
I see
truth.
What you mean. Exactly. It's like peeling back layers of an onion. Each layer might have historical hints, but the outer layers serve specific narrative purposes.
Yeah, and that complexity is what makes this issue so fascinating. Whether or not a historical Paul existed, his evolution as a character is a testament to how communities adapt legends to shape their identity.
Right, absolutely. And it's not just about one person, is it? It really reflects on how religions and institutions build authority and continuity through storytelling.
Exactly. It's like, and if you build it, they will come situation. Build a narrative with all these miraculous events and moral authority, and suddenly you've got a cornerstone for a global faith.
Mm-hmm. Spot on. So, in this podcast-style head-over-heels exploration, do we lean more towards Paul being a fantastic myth created to serve a purpose? Or is there room to believe in a historical figure whose story was just later dramatized?
I'd say there's room to entertain both possibilities. I mean, if you really look at the evidence, or the lack thereof, in archaeological records, it does seem that the story was magnified to meet theological aims. Yet, it's also possible that a real person inspired that myth. However, his historical footprint might be surprisingly light.
Yeah, that's a nuanced take. And just thinking about it, it's like our faith and historical inquiry, constantly balance between literal truth and symbolic truth. In the end, the story of Paul might be less about a man's life and more about the evolution of a community's belief.
Exactly. It's a mosaic of history, myth, and theology, layered in ways that force us to question our assumptions every step of the way.
Right, absolutely. Man, this conversation really makes me reflect on how narratives form our understanding of the past. Do you think such mythical embellishments serve a purpose beyond mere storytelling?
Well, definitely. It's almost like a kind of glue that holds communities together, providing a shared identity and a sense of continuity in a rapidly changing world.
Yep, that makes sense. And in this case, regardless of whether Paul was historical or myth, his story has undeniably shaped Christianity extensively.
Exactly. It shows us that sometimes the power of a narrative can eclipse the need for strict historical accuracy. It's the impact that counts.
I love how this discussion blends scholarship with a pinch of skepticism, reminding us that history is often more complicated than it first appears.
Yeah, it's like every legend, no matter how well crafted, invites both wonder and critical inquiry.
Right, indeed. So whether you're leaning towards Paul being the church's clever invention or a real, albeit mythologized figure, there's no denying that his legacy continues to spark debate and captivate our imaginations.
Exactly, and that ongoing debate is what keeps the conversation and the search for truth alive.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, thanks for this deep dive into one of Christianity's biggest controversies. It's been both challenging and enlightening.
Yeah, thanks for joining in. Here's to questioning established myths and seeking layered truths in our history.
Right, thanks a lot.